Hello and welcome back to macrobiology. Today we're going to talk about the egg. We've talked about how to select a mate. We've talked about how to, or the difference between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. We've talked about cellular reproduction. We've talked about what it takes as a parent to actually raise the offspring in terms of investment. And now we want to know what the egg is. I mean, what is in it anyway? So let's start with cell theory, because first of all, the egg, right, when we talk about this fertilized egg, it starts out as a cell, okay? And the theory of cells, cell theory, has really three big things that you need to know. And one is that all living things are made up of cells. The first life to evolve were single-celled organisms, and then you get complex organisms that you see today later on. But everything is made up of cells, so you could have an organism that is single-celled, which brings us to the second point. Cells are the smallest working units of all living things. Or they could actually be specialized and work together, right? Like you see in all of these complex organisms that we were just talking about. Now, the last thing, and probably most important thing, is that all cells come from other cells, right, pre-existing cells, through cell division, which we've already talked about when we were talking about mitosis, right? So there you go, a little bit about cell theory. So there are three basic types of cells. You've got the animal cells, which that's us. You've got plant cells, right? And we're going to talk about those. And then you've got prokaryotes, which are going to be the most common, right? Or the largest group are going to be the bacteria in terms of the prokaryotes. But the animal cells and the plant cells are eukaryotes. And so those are the ones that we're actually going to focus on, okay? And so there are... Sorry about that. There we go. There are several classification systems that you might be familiar with. There is the Five Kingdom system, which is one of the older ones. That was turned into the Six Kingdom system, which divides all of these different groups. So when you look at the Five and Six Kingdom systems, you're talking about the Monera, which then later gets divided between eubacteria and archaeobacteria. That's all bacteria over there. Then you have protists, and those are going to be the single-celled eukaryotes, right? And then you have plants, fungi, right? Mushrooms, yay, and animalia, which are all the other things. Now that's been changed into what we call the three-domain system, and kingdoms still exist. But remember from our taxonomy, does King Philip come over for great spaghetti? The D is domain, the K in king is for kingdom, right? And so this is a broader system when you start, it's more inclusive when you start out with the domains. And the domains are the eukarya, and those are all these groups right here, protists through animals. And then the eubacteria are just bacteria, and the archaeobacteria are archaea now. And bacteria are, well, they're bacteria, right? And then archaea, these are all what are called extremophiles. These are things that live in extreme conditions, intense heat, cold, radiation, whatever. That's archaea. Okay, so there's a little bit about classification. Right? And then here's some examples of cells. Here's an amoeba, right? Here's bacteria. This is a bacillus, it's a rod. Sometimes they're circular, and that would be coccus, right? C-O-C-C-O-S, and you've heard of that probably before in things like staphylococcus or streptococcus. But anyway, there's a type of bacteria. This is a nerve cell. It's a specialized cell. This is an artist rendition. It's not an actual picture. And then here's a plant cell. You can see it's got this nice wall around it, and we'll talk about those later on. Here's a blood cell. This is another differentiated cell. It's specialized like the nerve cell. Interesting side note on red blood cells is they don't have a nucleus, and we'll come back to that later on. And then, of course, the amoeba was a single-celled wow, totally lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. Single-celled eukaryote. Okay. Now, prokaryotes, these are the first cells. These are the ones to evolve first, and they are all over the place. They're all single-celled. That is unicellular. The key about prokaryotes is that they do not have internal membranes. They only have a plasma membrane, and that's the sac, basically, that surrounds the cell. They don't have very many internal structures. They definitely don't have a nucleus. They have DNA, but they don't have a nuclear membrane that encloses it. They don't have any of the other things like, you know, all of the Golgi bodies and the endoplasmic reticulum and the mitochondria and all those. They don't have any of that, okay? So they've just got that DNA that's it kind of collects in an area called the nucleoid. But other than that, they're very, very simple. And the prokaryotes, remember, are all the bacteria and the archaea. And here's just an example. You can see they do have ribosomes, right? Everybody's got ribosomes, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. Again, this is a bacillus, right? A lot of times they'll have a flagella, which is a little tail that turns, and that's for motion. They might not. These are the coccus that I was talking about right here. See the little circles? They have a cell wall, right? They have a plasma membrane. And these can be different depending. They can be different thicknesses depending on the different kind of bacteria. And some are surrounded by what's called a capsule. And then here is the nucleoid region. That's that collection of DNA. And you can see here's a real picture. So here's that DNA. Here's some ribosomes, things like that. Oh, they're smaller, by the way. Prokaryotes are a lot smaller than eukaryotes. Eukaryotes have a nucleus, right? It has a nuclear membrane. They can be unicellular or multicellular. And unicellular, all the protists are unicellular. All plants and animals are multicellular, and fungi can actually be either. It can be multicellular or unicellular. And we're not really going to talk about fungi very much, but they're very interesting, just as an aside. Okay, so the eukaryotic cell, this is the one that you've learned about probably in middle school, or if you've taken other biology classes. And you can see they're a lot more complex. They're a lot larger. They have a lot more stuff going on, right? Here's the nucleus. Yeah, and then the nucleus has a membrane, and it'll always have a little darker part, and that's the nucleolus. And this is this, darker. And we'll get to what the nucleolus is in just a second, but there it is. And then you've got your ribosomes, which you saw in the bacterial cells, but now you have all of these other things that are in it too, and we're going to talk about those. Okay, now plant cells. I'm sorry, this is an animal cell still. Here's an actual picture, right? Actual picture? Okay. So there you go. This, by the way, is the animal cell, and this is an algae cell, an algal cell. Okay, and so you can see some differences there. Plant, anything that's going to be a photosynthesizer, a plant or algae, algae are single cell, by the way, is going to have chloroplasts, right? Whereas animal cells don't have those, and we'll talk about that later on. But here again, there's that split. Here's the plant side. Here's the animal side. Right. Now, these are actually not real cells. These are two pictures that are put together so you can compare plant cells and animal cells. Please understand that. Okay, so why are cells so small? Well, it turns out that when you have this cell, and we were talking about cell division, that when they get to a certain size, that they have to divide because the surface to area to volume ratio is no good, right? Because the surface is where everything is happening. You transport nutrients in and waste out, right? And this is a little review of what we were talking about when we talked about cellular reproduction. But the surface area doesn't change as rapidly as the volume does. And so you can't have enough nutrients in or waste out if the cell is too big. So they're limited by this surface area to volume ratio. And so there are a couple of strategies to kind of maximize that. You can be long and narrow, that gives you more surface area. You can be frilly, right, which means that you have these little ruffled edges. But those can make them a little bit bigger. But round cells are always going to be small, right? Round cells are going to be probably the smallest in many cases. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about basic cell structure. First of all, there are some common structures to all cells, regardless of what they are, whether they're prokaryotes or eukaryotes. And that is, there's a plasma membrane that encases the cytoplasm and the ribosomes and the DNA, right? And the cytoplasm is the stuff, right, that everything's floating in. The ribosomes we'll talk about in a minute. You've got your DNA, and then you have biochemical molecules, nutrients, and then you have biochemical pathways. You have enzymes that are doing things, right? You have all these processes that are going on. It may be photosynthesis, it may be respiration, whatever, but all of these things are happening. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the plasma membrane first. Like I said, this is the gatekeeper. This controls what enters and leaves the cells. It is usually a double membrane, okay? And these membranes can be different thicknesses depending on what you're talking about. They can have different things in them depending on what kind of cell you're talking about. But everybody's got a plasma membrane, which is also called the cell membrane. Now, plants, algae, and bacteria also have a cell wall. Animals do not have a cell wall, right? But this is something that just provides additional structure, and it is one of the things that helps retain fluids inside the cell, and maintains pressure difference between outside and inside. And so, cell wall, right? And in plants, in woody plants, it's a very rigid structure. In other ones, it's just kind of tough, maybe a little bit more flexible. But this is why trees, for instance, have that hardness, right? They're all, tree-like, if you will. Okay, now the cytoplasm is this jelly-like substance that's inside the cell. All of the organelles float in it. Its primary component is water. It's basically the goo in the cell. All right, now the organelles are the things in the cells. Now remember, prokaryotes do not have organelles, so we have moved into eukaryotes only. And there are major organelles are the nucleus, ribosomes, mitochondria, Golgi bodies, the endoplasmic reticulum, lysosomes, vacuoles, and in plants, they're also chloroplasts. Okay, so the nucleus is the thing that directs all of the cell activities. It's where all the DNA is, and so it's everything the cell is or can be or whatever. It has a nuclear membrane, and so it's separate from the cytoplasm and all the other organelles because it has this membrane. And when you have DNA replication or you have things that are made in the nucleus, they have to be transported across the nuclear membrane. For instance, like some of the RNA has to go, and we're not really talking about RNA, but RNA is what you actually use to make proteins, things like enzymes that will regulate functions, stuff like that. That's one of the functions of RNA. But anyway, that has to be transported across the membrane, and then any of the molecules that are going to make, say, DNA, for instance, all of those bases, right, they have to come in across the nuclear membrane as well a lot of times. Okay, now the nucleolus is simply this condensed DNA. It's where the RNA, the ribosomal RNA that I was just talking about, was transcribed, and the ribosomal RNA is what is going to make up the ribosomes, which we're going to talk about next time, right? It's very, very important. So in the DNA in this area codes for the proteins that make up, or sorry, the RNA that makes up the ribosome, and then ribosomes are responsible for making proteins off of another type of RNA. Wow, I don't know what's wrong with me today. RNA. There we go. Okay, so the nuclear membrane also is made up of this double layer, and the majority of these membranes are double layers. So there you go. And it has little pores all over it, and everything that comes in and out of it has to go through these pores. Okay, now there's also the endoplasmic reticulum, and that surrounds the nucleus, and it's this layered membrane, and it's basically like a highway system. It doesn't make the proteins, but it transports the proteins, and the ribosomes that actually make the proteins sit on top of part of that endoplasmic reticulum, which is why we have here make and transport proteins. It's actually the ribosomes that make the proteins, but then the endoplasmic reticulum is like a highway that transports them. Oh, and by the way, just on a side note, there's really two types of endoplasmic reticulum. There's the smooth and the rough. The rough is where the ribosomes are, and the smooth does not have ribosomes. It's a little transport system. It also makes these little vesicles over here. Okay, ribosome, they're going to translate what's called messenger RNA to make proteins for whatever the cell needs them for, so, communication, regulatory processes, or regulating processes, things like that. The ribosome, like we said earlier, is made up of ribosomal RNA, right, subunits, and then some proteins. And they can free float, right, in the cytoplasm, or they can be attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. Either way, but they always are making these proteins. They're translating mRNA, and that's called translation when you make proteins from RNA. Okay, now mitochondria, these are the powerhouses of the cell. And these produce energy. They break down fats and carbohydrates. They control water and other materials in the cell. Part of what they do is recycle they can decompose proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. They do contain their own DNA, and they can replicate themselves. And because they do, the site of cellular respiration, by the way, is kind of the big point here. It's the site of cellular respiration. They can this fact that they are surrounded by this membrane, and that they do contain DNA, and they can replicate themselves. Led to the idea that they might have in fact been something else at one time. And so what you're looking at is the mitochondria within the cell. This is an endosymbiotic relationship. The mitochondria were probably purple bacteria that infected a eukaryotic cell, and that relationship started as an infection, which is antagonistic, and then became, and I don't mean antagonistic in the whole typical like relationship. I mean the not friendly antagonism. Anyway, and so they become dependent on each other, right? And so that's where the symbiotic relationship comes from. The mitochondria gets the materials it needs, and then the cell can use the ATP that's produced in respiration. Okay, and here's the mitochondria. You can see that it has all of this little inner membrane action going on. There's the outer membrane, right? You don't actually need to know any of the other parts. I'm just showing you the picture. And you can see it looks like it could have been a little bacteria at one time. Okay, the Golgi apparatus or Golgi bodies, this is like the packing plant, right? And so they're going to move materials into the cell, or within the cell rather, and then out of the cell. This is also where you get proteins to be modified, because some proteins have to be modified to work. They need to change their shape, or parts of it have to be added or cut off or methylated or whatever. And this happens with the Golgi bodies. The other really important thing that they do is make lysosomes. And lysosomes are responsible for all kinds of things. They're the defense system. They're going to attack and break apart any sort of invaders, any pathogens, things like that. They're also going to recycle parts of the cell. And then when it's time for the cell to die, which is called apoptosis, which is scheduled, kind of a programmed cell death, because cells have a specific lifespan. They're going to be responsible for breaking down the cell, and then it gets recycled and all this good stuff. Okay, and that's what we were just talking about, the lysosome. Yeah, so this is everything that I just said about lysosomes. And lysozyme, by the way, is the enzyme that is stored in lysosomes. Anything that ends in yme is an enzyme. And this is actually a really fun picture, because this is a phagocyte, right? And this is something that's going to this is a little vesicle that's going to bring stuff in from the outside. It can be food, nutrients, right? Or it can be pathogens. And then those are going to fuse with the lysosome, and they make a phagolysosome, and that's where all of this breakdown is happening. And then they can be used, or if it's part of the immune system, then they'll take parts of the pathogen and use it in the adaptive response system for the immune system. If it's nutrients, they're going to release them so they can be used, whatever. They also will take damaged organelles, and they'll break those down so those materials can be used in making a new organelle. Okay, vacuoles, sounds like vacuum. These basically are kind of the bags in the cell. They store stuff, right? They're membrane-bound sacs, and they will hold things, for storage, right? Until they're to be used. They'll hold them for digestion, right, until it's time to do that. And then they'll also take waste, and the vacuoles are responsible for waste removal. They're larger in plant cells to help maintain the shapes. So if you see a giant vacuole, you're looking at a plant. Okay, now speaking of plants have something that animals don't, and that is chloroplasts. And also algae and some bacteria have these too. These are, in some ways, like the mitochondria. These are also endosymbiotic. These probably started out as bacteria that infected eukaryotic or bacterial cell, and then they probably started with bacterial cells, and then, later on, you have this relationship already set up. But because they photosynthesize, they're producing energy molecules for the cell as well. And so, like the mitochondria, just mitochondria or cellular respiration, chloroplasts or photosynthesis, but it works out in kind of the same idea. Okay, so the big cellular processes, and some of these we've talked about before. Respiration we've talked about. Osmosis is the transport of water back and forth. Diffusion is the transport of anything else back and forth across a membrane. And then photosynthesis we've talked about. And remember, that's photoautotrophs only. Yeah, everybody respires, but only photoautotrophs photosynthesize. Okay, if you have any questions about what we've talked about in this particular discussion, please let me know at the beginning of the next class. And otherwise, that is what is in a cell, right? And all fertilized eggs that start offspring are going to be starting out as single cells. So now you know what's inside. All right, thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.